When senior officials from rival and partner nations gather for a state funeral, the ceremony itself is rarely the only story unfolding. Behind the formal condolences, carefully choreographed protocol, and public photographs lies another layer of diplomacy, one measured not by speeches, but by presence, timing, and symbolism. Experienced strategists often pay closer attention to who attends, who meets behind closed doors, and which messages are delivered without being spoken aloud. That is why reports surrounding Dmitry Medvedev's participation in events connected to Iran attracted attention far beyond Tehran. If such high-level engagements are confirmed, they should be viewed not simply as acts of respect, but as opportunities for strategic communication. The real question is not what was said publicly, it is what different audiences were meant to understand from Russia's choice of representation. Most viewers see a funeral. Strategists see a geopolitical summit. Why would a moment centered on Iran also capture the attention of policymakers in Berlin? Why would Belarus, thousands of kilometers away, still matter to the calculations? And why might one carefully staged diplomatic appearance speak simultaneously to allies, rivals, and undecided states? The answers are unlikely to be found in ceremonial rituals alone. They lie in the wider contest over European security, military deterrence, alliance politics, and the increasingly interconnected relationship between the Middle East and Eastern Europe. What appears to be a single diplomatic event may, in reality, serve multiple strategic purposes at once. But the real story isn't in Tehran, it may be in Europe. To understand whether this event truly carried a broader geopolitical message, we first need to separate established facts from strategic interpretation and reconstruct the context in which it unfolded. To understand why this event drew such widespread attention, it is important to begin with the verified facts before moving into broader strategic analysis. Following the death of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Tehran organized an extended state funeral attended by senior Iranian officials and delegations from numerous countries. Russia confirmed that Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council and a former president, would represent Moscow at the ceremony, underscoring the significance the Kremlin attached to the occasion. On the surface, the visit followed established diplomatic practice. States routinely send high-ranking representatives to the funerals of influential foreign leaders, particularly when long-standing political relationships exist. Yet Russia's decision also attracted attention because it came at a time when Moscow's strategic partnerships were under increasing international scrutiny. Any interpretation beyond those confirmed diplomatic facts, however, remains analysis rather than established evidence. Russia and Iran have expanded cooperation in recent years across several areas, including defense coordination, energy discussions, regional diplomacy, and efforts to reduce the impact of Western sanctions. Although their interests are not identical in every theater, both governments have frequently presented themselves as supporters of a more multipolar international order and have coordinated on issues where their objectives overlap. Germany, meanwhile, occupies a very different position in this geopolitical landscape. As Europe's largest economy and one of Ukraine's principal supporters since Russia's full-scale invasion, Berlin has become central to debates over European defense spending, sanctions policy, and NATO's long-term strategy. Decisions made in Germany often influence the wider European Union, making the country an important audience for Russian diplomatic messaging, whether direct or indirect. Belarus represents another essential piece of the puzzle. Moscow regards its close military and political partnership with Minsk as a key element of its Western security architecture. Developments involving Belarus therefore carry significance far beyond its borders, particularly in discussions surrounding deterrence and regional stability. At first glance, these developments appear unrelated. A funeral in Tehran, Germany's security calculations, Belarus's strategic position, and NATO's evolving posture seem to belong to separate stories. But beneath the headlines, a larger strategic pattern begins to emerge. Today's diplomatic signals only make sense when viewed through decades of geopolitical history. To understand why Russia's representation at a major Iranian state ceremony attracted such close attention, it is necessary to step back from the immediate headlines and examine the strategic relationships that have been developing for decades. None of these partnerships emerged overnight. Each has been shaped by changing security concerns, shifting alliances, and evolving perceptions of the international order. Relations between Russia and Iran have experienced periods of both cooperation and tension. Since the end of the Cold War, however, shared interests have gradually brought the two countries closer together on a range of regional and international issues. Cooperation has expanded in areas such as energy, diplomacy, and defense, while both governments have frequently opposed what they describe as excessive Western influence over global affairs. Their partnership is pragmatic rather than identical in outlook, but it has become increasingly important as both countries have faced extensive sanctions and diplomatic pressure from the United States and many European governments. At the same time, Russia's relationship with Europe followed a very different trajectory. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, many Western governments viewed NATO enlargement as a means of promoting stability across Central and Eastern Europe. Moscow, however, consistently argued that the alliance's expansion toward its borders altered the regional security balance and reduced Russia's strategic depth. Whether one agrees with that assessment or not, these concerns became a recurring feature of Russian foreign and defense policy, influencing its responses to developments across the European continent. Germany occupies a particularly important position within that landscape. As Europe's largest economy and one of its most influential political actors, Berlin has often played a central role in shaping European Union policy toward Russia. Following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Germany announced a significant shift in its defense posture, increasing military investment and reassessing long-held assumptions about European security. That transformation has made Germany an even more significant factor in Moscow's strategic calculations. Belarus has also become increasingly integrated into Russia's security architecture. Military cooperation, joint exercises, and expanded defense coordination have strengthened the relationship between the two countries. From Moscow's perspective, Belarus provides strategic depth along its western frontier, while for many NATO members, it represents an important element of the alliance's regional security environment. This contrast illustrates how the same geographic space can carry very different meanings for different actors. Meanwhile, the Middle East and Europe have become more interconnected than they once appeared. Energy markets, sanctions, transportation corridors, and military cooperation increasingly link developments in one region to strategic calculations in the other. A diplomatic event in Tehran can therefore resonate far beyond the Middle East, influencing discussions in European capitals about energy security, regional stability, and broader geopolitical competition. History also demonstrates that state ceremonies frequently serve purposes extending beyond remembrance. Throughout modern diplomacy, leaders have used commemorations, funerals, and other symbolic occasions to conduct meetings, reinforce partnerships, and communicate priorities without formal negotiations dominating the headlines. Public diplomacy and strategic signaling often occur simultaneously, while ceremony and statecraft become difficult to separate. History reveals that symbolic events often precede important shifts in international politics. But the deeper story begins not with protocol or tradition, but with Russia's broader strategic objectives. With that historical foundation established, we can now examine the calculations that may lie behind Moscow's actions and why this seemingly ceremonial moment attracted attention far beyond Tehran. With the historical context in place, the focus shifts from what happened to what the event may have communicated. In geopolitics, symbolism is rarely separate from strategy. Highly visible diplomatic occasions often become platforms for signaling, allowing governments to reinforce relationships, shape perceptions, and influence multiple audiences without issuing direct ultimatums. The significance lies not only in attendance, but in the strategic environment surrounding that attendance. One useful concept is strategic signaling. States frequently send messages through actions rather than formal declarations because actions leave room for interpretation while still conveying intent. A senior delegation at an important state ceremony can reassure partners, demonstrate continuity, and project confidence without changing official policy. Such gestures are especially valuable during periods of heightened international tension, when every public appearance is closely examined by allies and rivals alike. If Russia intended to maximize the political value of its representation, the audience was unlikely to be limited to Iranian leaders alone. Tehran may have been the location, but the observers extended far beyond Iran. Decision-makers in European capitals, officials within NATO, policymakers in Washington, and governments across the global South would all have interpreted the symbolism through their own strategic perspectives. This is one reason diplomatic events often have several audiences simultaneously, each receiving a slightly different message from the same action. For Iran, the signal could be interpreted as one of continuity. Moscow has worked with Tehran on regional diplomacy, energy cooperation, and defense-related issues where their interests overlap. Maintaining visible engagement during a leadership transition can reinforce the perception that bilateral relations remain stable despite broader geopolitical uncertainty. That does not mean both countries agree on every issue, but it demonstrates that channels of communication remain active. For Belarus, the implications are different. Belarus occupies a central position in Russia's Western security posture. Military cooperation, joint planning, and geographic proximity make Minsk an important component of Moscow's regional defense calculations. Visible diplomatic engagement elsewhere can indirectly reinforce confidence among allies by demonstrating that Russia continues to manage multiple strategic relationships simultaneously rather than focusing on a single theater. Such messaging can be as important psychologically as it is diplomatically. Germany represents another significant audience. As Europe's largest economy and one of NATO's most influential members, Berlin plays a critical role in sanctions policy, defense investment, and European security planning. Russian strategic communication has frequently considered Germany's importance because decisions made in Berlin often shape broader European responses. A symbolic diplomatic appearance does not alter Germany's policies by itself, but it may contribute to a wider narrative about Russia's international partnerships and diplomatic reach. This illustrates the distinction between tactical symbolism and strategic communication. A single event may appear ceremonial in isolation, yet it can contribute to longer-term efforts aimed at influencing perceptions. Governments seek not only to affect immediate decisions, but also to shape how other states evaluate credibility, resilience, and political resolve. In international relations, perception can influence policy almost as much as material capability. Another important dimension involves deterrence. Deterrence is often associated with military hardware, but it also depends on political messaging. States attempt to convince potential adversaries that they possess both the capability and the willingness to defend their interests. Diplomatic visibility can complement military posture by reinforcing the impression that alliances remain intact and strategic partnerships continue despite external pressure. Economic considerations also form part of the equation. Russia and Iran have both faced extensive sanctions from Western governments, encouraging efforts to expand alternative trade mechanisms, financial cooperation, and energy coordination. Public diplomatic engagement can therefore carry economic symbolism alongside political messaging, suggesting that sanctioned states continue seeking new partnerships rather than accepting isolation. Whether such efforts achieve their intended objectives is a separate question, but the signaling itself remains significant. Information and perception management should also be considered carefully. Modern geopolitics extends beyond military deployments into the competition over narratives. Governments understand that international audiences interpret images, meetings, and diplomatic visits as indicators of influence. Without making unsupported assumptions about intent, it is reasonable to observe that symbolic events provide opportunities for governments to reinforce preferred narratives about stability, legitimacy, and international relevance. This broader perspective also helps explain why analysts often distinguish between visible diplomacy and underlying strategic objectives. Public ceremonies are designed to be seen, but the conversations surrounding them frequently concern issues extending well beyond the official occasion. Energy security, regional conflicts, alliance management, sanctions, and military cooperation may all influence the significance attached to a single diplomatic appearance. This is where everything changes. The funeral itself may be temporary, but the strategic message, whatever each observer believes it to be, could shape perceptions long after the ceremony concludes. What most people miss is that the most important audience may never have been sitting in Tehran at all. If these calculations are broadly correct, then the implications extend far beyond one diplomatic event and into the wider balance of power shaping today's international system. If the previous analysis is correct, then the significance of this diplomatic episode extends well beyond symbolism. Individual meetings may last only hours, but the perceptions they create can influence strategic planning for months or even years. In international politics, governments constantly assess not only military capabilities, but also political intent, alliance cohesion, and the credibility of their competitors. That is why events that appear ceremonial can still shape broader geopolitical calculations. For Europe, the implications center on security planning. NATO members continuously evaluate changes in Russia's diplomatic relationships alongside developments on the military front. Visible cooperation between Moscow and Tehran may reinforce concerns that Russia continues to maintain influential partnerships despite sustained sanctions and political isolation efforts. Whether those partnerships fundamentally alter Europe's security environment is open to debate, but they inevitably become part of the alliance's broader strategic assessment. Germany occupies a particularly influential position within that discussion. As one of Europe's leading economic and political powers, Berlin plays a major role in determining the direction of European Union policy and contributes significantly to NATO's long-term planning. Russian diplomatic engagement with key international partners may therefore be interpreted in Germany not simply as foreign policy activity, but as part of a wider effort to demonstrate strategic endurance. Such perceptions can influence debates over defense spending, industrial capacity, and future security commitments. Iran also gains importance within this broader picture. Its regional influence, energy resources, and expanding diplomatic relationships make it an increasingly significant participant in discussions about the future international order. Continued engagement between Moscow and Tehran may encourage both countries to deepen cooperation where their interests converge, particularly in areas involving trade, transportation corridors, and sanctions adaptation. At the same time, differences in national priorities mean that cooperation should not automatically be interpreted as complete strategic alignment. Belarus remains another critical factor. Its military integration with Russia contributes to Moscow's Western defense posture while remaining a focal point for NATO's regional planning. Any signal suggesting continued Russian commitment to allied partnerships can reinforce Belarus's perceived importance within the evolving European security landscape. Economic considerations further expand the significance of these developments. Energy markets remain highly sensitive to geopolitical uncertainty, and diplomatic relationships often influence expectations about future supply routes, investment decisions, and regional stability. Likewise, sanctions policies are not static. Governments continually assess whether existing measures remain effective or whether adjustments become necessary as international partnerships evolve. Military-industrial cooperation also deserves attention. Although public diplomatic events rarely announce detailed defense arrangements, they can reinforce confidence between governments already engaged in security cooperation. Strategic relationships are strengthened not only through formal agreements, but also through repeated demonstrations of political commitment. Perhaps the most important consequence, however, involves perception. Credibility is a form of strategic capital. Governments seek to convince allies that they remain dependable while persuading competitors that pressure has not weakened their resolve. Images of diplomatic engagement, high-level attendance, and continued international outreach all contribute to that broader contest over influence. But none of these consequences are guaranteed. Diplomatic signals acquire meaning only through the reactions they generate. Everything now depends on how Moscow, Berlin, Tehran, Minsk, Brussels, and other major capitals interpret both the symbolism and the strategic intent behind these developments. So what happens if each major player begins adjusting its strategy in response? The future significance of this episode depends not on the ceremony itself, but on how governments respond in the weeks and months that follow. Diplomatic symbolism can influence strategic thinking, yet it does not determine policy on its own. Every major actor still has choices, and those choices will shape the next phase of this evolving geopolitical landscape. Rather than predicting a single outcome, it is more useful to examine several realistic scenarios based on current trends and established strategic interests. The first possibility is that Russia continues to deepen coordination with Iran while maintaining pressure on Europe. This would not necessarily require dramatic new agreements. Instead, it could involve expanding existing cooperation in areas such as regional diplomacy, trade, transportation links, energy, and selected defense activities where mutual interests already exist. From Moscow's perspective, stronger ties with non-Western partners may help demonstrate resilience in the face of sanctions and diplomatic pressure. For Iran, continued engagement with Russia could provide additional political and economic opportunities, although Tehran would still balance those relationships against its own national priorities and regional objectives. A second scenario centers on Germany and the wider NATO alliance. Berlin has already undertaken significant changes to its defense policy in recent years, and any perception that Russia is strengthening strategic partnerships abroad could reinforce existing arguments for continued military modernization and closer alliance coordination. Rather than weakening European resolve, visible Russian diplomacy might encourage NATO members to increase investment in defense capabilities, intelligence sharing, and industrial cooperation. In that sense, one side's strategic messaging may produce the opposite reaction from its intended audience. The third scenario involves Belarus becoming even more closely integrated into Russia's regional security framework. Joint military planning, expanded exercises, and deeper institutional cooperation could continue if both governments conclude that the regional security environment remains unstable. Such developments would likely receive close attention from neighboring NATO members, prompting further assessments of force posture, deterrence planning, and regional readiness. Whether this results in greater stability or increased tension would depend largely on how each side interprets the other's intentions. A fourth possibility is often overlooked because it appears less dramatic. Diplomatic engagement could continue even amid strategic competition, reducing the risk of miscalculation without fundamentally resolving underlying disagreements. History shows that rival powers frequently maintain communication while simultaneously competing across political, economic, and military domains. High-level dialogue does not necessarily indicate improved relations, but it can provide mechanisms for crisis management and reduce the chances of unintended escalation. Across all four scenarios, economic pressures remain an important variable. Energy markets, sanctions policies, technological cooperation, and global trade routes continue to influence national decision-making alongside traditional security concerns. Governments rarely respond to geopolitical events based on military considerations alone. Economic resilience increasingly shapes strategic flexibility. None of these outcomes are predetermined. International politics is influenced by leadership decisions, domestic priorities, alliance dynamics, and unexpected external events. The next decisions made in Moscow, Berlin, Tehran, Minsk, Brussels, and Washington could alter the trajectory in ways that are difficult to anticipate today. Ultimately, the significance of this event depends less on the ceremony itself than on the strategic choices that follow. Those choices, not the symbolism alone, will determine whether this moment becomes a brief diplomatic episode or an early indicator of a broader shift in the international balance of power. So we return to the question that framed this entire discussion. Was this simply a state funeral attended by foreign representatives, or was it also a carefully timed act of geopolitical communication? The answer depends not on assumptions, but on how we interpret the broader strategic environment. Diplomatic ceremonies are public events, yet their significance often extends far beyond what is visible on camera. Throughout history, governments have used symbolism, timing, and carefully chosen representation to reinforce alliances, reassure partners, influence rivals, and shape international perceptions. Military power remains important, but strategy is not expressed through military capability alone. It is also communicated through diplomatic presence, political signals, and the ability to influence how other states interpret unfolding events. This episode also illustrates how deeply interconnected today's geopolitical landscape has become. A development in Tehran can attract attention in Berlin, influence discussions within NATO, affect calculations in Minsk, and contribute to wider debates about energy security, sanctions, and the future balance of power. The Middle East and Europe are no longer separate strategic theaters. Decisions in one region increasingly shape the choices made in another. At the same time, careful analysis requires discipline. Established facts should remain separate from interpretation, and strategic assessments should acknowledge uncertainty rather than present speculation as certainty. That distinction is essential for understanding international affairs objectively. History may remember the ceremony, but strategists will remember the message, or perhaps more accurately, the different messages that various governments believed they received. Whether those interpretations ultimately prove correct will depend on the policies adopted in the months and years ahead. The next chapter will not be written by speeches or ceremonial appearances alone. It will be written through decisions on diplomacy, defense, economic cooperation, and alliance management. In geopolitics, the most consequential messages are often delivered without a single public declaration.